See, it's a blessing to be able to share my research with you all this afternoon. I'm really glad that I can have an opportunity to have it recorded for posterity. I'm really glad that we can all be here together to help celebrate the Black collections at ASU Archives. When I was working on my dissertation, I didn't believe that it'd be possible to write about local communities of color due to their exclusion from our repositories. When you start digging into the archives, this absence, it made Black folks in particular really indiscernible within the broader historical narratives that have come to outline our history in metropolitan Phoenix. My dissertation was a history of the Maryvale community. In many ways, one of the reasons I looked at it was because I wanted to get a sense of who Black Arizonans were, Black Phoenicians were, and I saw that as being a way to accomplish that specific task. But due to the trailblazing efforts of our archivists to document and collect history on communities of color, Jessica in particular, through a curation of the Black collection, she's developed an unprecedented opportunity for students and scholars to conduct historical research on the Black experience in our region. Nancy as well has done revolutionary work leading the community-driven archives project, as well as inheriting the Chicano collection over the past few years. Their efforts to preserve archival records from our community is really shifted the potential for research on communities of color in the Valley. And it's really great to see now that where before I didn't see as much of an opportunity, now I see a boundless amount. So as a scholar and as a community involved person in that sense, thank you guys for your efforts, your dedication to recovering these hidden histories. We really need it. Next slide. So I want to start with doing a shout out to some ancestors and some elders. My scholarship particularly is indebted to African-American journalists such as Marion Bacotes, Close Campbell, and Ava Hackett. You can click through the slide now. These folks, these journalists in particular, they collected our stories when academic presses wouldn't publish them and mainstream media wouldn't cover them. So Richard E. Harris, he was the first African-American hired to write at the Arizona Republic. He believed that Black journalists were like, quote, the griots of their ancestral Africans, orally recounting the deeds of their people, spreading knowledge as well as entertainment. You can go on to the next slide. During the 70s, Allen worked with the Phoenix Urban League to develop a pamphlet series on local African-American history, and he eventually published his book, The First 100 Years, A History of Arizona Blacks, next slide, which was to ensure that our history could be documented for future generations. To me, this text has been a touchstone for the greater understanding of our history and how it's central to the development of the American Southwest. It's in the middle of my slide right here. It's available at the Arizona Library or ASU Library. I'd suggest that you check it out if you can. Okay, so in this manuscript, Harris hints at several themes that I am going to argue are critical to understanding the history of Black Arizonans. They're not exhaustive, but they outline some of the broader contours of our community. Next slide. First, there's the idea of migration. So apocryphally, for every 3 people who move here, 2 move away. But in this sense, migration has been one of the fundamental aspects of Black Arizona history since, I guess we could say it began. The first non-Indigenous person recorded in Arizona is Esteban or Mustafa Azamaria. He's a man seen here on the screen. He was a Moroccan man enslaved by Spaniards in the early 16th century. Contemporary scholars have concluded that after he and some of his colleagues shipwrecked along the Gulf Coast in 1528, the multilingual medicine man was the primary intercessor between Spanish explorers and indigenous parties, as he led famed conquistador Cabeza de Vaca on a decade-long odyssey back to the Spanish flag in Mexico City. This successful sojourn across North America impressed leading colonial officials, and after being sold to the Viceroy of New Spain, Esteban led Franciscan friar Marcos de Niza through the southeastern part of our state, with contemporary Santa Cruz County. And in this sense, he predates the European presence in this part of the globe. This occurs on their way to find the, quote, 7 cities of Cibola in what's supposed to be modern day New Mexico, but his migratory path through the state of Arizona reflects the temporary status of many Black Arizonans. It also, I would argue, reflects how critical Black labor has been to European colonization in this region of the globe. There would be no Arizona without workers of African descent. Next slide. So another theme that Harris discusses is multiculturalism. Multiracial families, not explorers, they comprise most of the initial Black population in territorial Arizona. Next slide, please. Samuel Bostic, he was the first Black politician in the territory. He rose from slavery to become the most prominent member of Tucson's minuscule Black community. He had been born in slavery during the 1830s, but began adulthood working his way towards emancipation on the violent Kansas frontier. He arrived in Tucson during the Civil War, and by 1868, he had regular advertisements for his barbering services in Anglo newspapers. He also had acquired financing to open a restaurant and the first public bathhouse in Tucson. People could not take baths unless they were at their own private residence before he did. And this is in a time without running water. So a public bathhouse was critical to public health at the time. He was able to achieve this success through myriad multiracial relationships. Mexican Americans were witnesses at his Catholic wedding to Albina Barraga. She was a Sornise woman with whom he had around a half dozen children. An Anglo judge oversaw the ceremony. At the time, anti-miscegenation statutes should have made this illegal, but people were willing to look the other way because he was part of the broader community. His personal relationships helped augment his business relationships. By 1870, Bostic had amassed assets worth over around $2,000 in value. Moreover, his ownership, it sustained a multiracial community within, at that time, Tucson as being a multiracial city. His bathhouse was located on prime real estate near offices and a drugstore, and it provided housing for Black, Anglo, and Mexican workers. Nearly half the African Americans in town actually found accommodations in one of his buildings. He also leased the Shoe Fly restaurant, which gained great renown among travelers, and he hosted many leading politicians in the territorial government. He was their personal barber. So despite his recent emancipation, multiracial relationships helped him come to own several of the foremost establishments in the postbellum Old Pueblo. And so finally, if first there is migration, second, there are multiracial relationships that conclude by looking at the role of the military. So Buffalo soldiers, they were named for their hair texture, resembled the wool of a plains buffalo. They've been in Arizona since around the late 1860s. The 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments helped capture the famous Apache independence fighter Geronimo. In the early 20th century, these men were stationed at Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona. And so many Black Arizonans today are still descended from the veterans who decided to reside in this region after ending their service. For many vets, their civilian service is comparable to anything they accomplished in uniform. Let's take the case of the man on the far right, Henry O. Flipper. He was the first African-American graduate of West Point. His dishonorable discharge on fraudulent allegations is a blemish in our military history. It took decades after he left this mortal coil for that specific injustice to be rectified. But during his lifetime, after his discharge, Flipper settled as a bachelor in southern Arizona with the belief that people were not so, quote, prejudiced and mean as they are in the South. However, after the land fraud associated with the Peralta land grant, which is a topic beyond the scope of this discussion, but is explored in a magisterial monograph by ASU professor Anita Huizar Hernandez. So after the fraudulent Peralta land grant, a federal court of private claims was established to clear legal title on land tenure in the region. People had previously said that they were granted land under Spanish crown. These were fraudulent records. It was really unclear who owned what. And so, fluent in Spanish, Flipper was hired by government lawyers to translate thousands of title records and help distinguish authentic land claims from fraudulent evidence. When the Los Nogales de Elias grant, this is a grant that's similar to the Peralta land grant, the fraudulent act, but it would have obliterated land claims in the town of Nogales. In fact, I believe one of these grants would have been so preposterous in a sort of way as to claim ownership over an eighth of the state. So once this specific land grant came before the court, Flipper was the only witness government lawyers needed to stake their claim that it was fraudulent. His legitimacy from extensive surveying experience in Mexico led to a rapid judgment against fraudulent grant holders and in the favor of people of Nogales. So what I would argue is that if anything, Flipper should be remembered not for his military discharge, but for his skilled service to the people of Southern Arizona. Next slide. And so this gets us to a duality in humanity. It has to be said, I spend much of my time teaching the human event. So in this sort of sense, being at Barrett's Honors College, I'm often thinking about the broader philosophy and how to include it within my pedagogy as a way to explain some of these ideas to students. So when we talk about duality, next slide, please, this brings up the yin yang of Eastern philosophy. And I would argue that it's particularly pernicious within the study of Black Arizonan history. While there's a light side to our collective history, there's also an impending darkness that seems to overtake these individual historical narratives we may know. So in this sense, someone such as Flipper, he's a familiar figure within Black Arizona. He's a migrant and military veteran, and he lives in a multicultural community. But it's not his excesses, but the racist injustice of his military service for which he's most prominently remembered. Similarly, Bostic, who ran for public office in 1870, that was the same year where the Arizona Democratic Party would campaign on a platform that said, no Negroes or Chinamen should be able to vote. That was their campaign. But he ran for political office in that year. He would, however, eventually be forced out of business due to white nationalism in Tucson. This disheartening move also follows Esteban. Shortly after he traverses Arizona as the first non-Indigenous person to come here, he mysteriously disappears in New Mexico, and there's only tales of a violent demise by Zuni chieftains, frightened allegedly that he would bring death and misfortune to their home. But his body was never recovered, and he left no written records to prove or disprove any of the claims about him. So there is a duality. Yes, there's these lighter themes in a way: migration, military service, multiculturalism, but there's also a dark side of misery, mystery, and mythology. So if we go to the next slide, this is not the direction I want to guide my students towards seeing. I want to figure out how we can find the better angels in our experience. And it's a tough thing. Especially if we go back and look at our history, looking at Black Arizona during early statehood, we wind up seeing a difference between the frontier, where these histories are tinged with a modicum of liberty, to during the period of statehood to make Arizona seem more progressive or modern. I mean, honestly, just more American. There was a desire to whiten the population. It became paramount as the territory approached statehood. Next slide, please. At the time, Arizona was seen as a dangerous borderland where ethnic Mexicans, indigenous people, and Chinese workers, Japanese farmers, they were all threats to Anglo supremacy in the region. So to ensure political control, tactics from the Jim Crow South were imported to Arizona, making the small Black population a central target of efforts to eliminate people of color from the broader body politic. This can be seen in the work of scholars such as Eric Meeks and his Border Citizen. In fact, one of the things he's able to discuss is how anti-miscegenation legislation, so that was basically legislation that prevented the marriage of people of different racial backgrounds. It began with a focus on, quote, Blacks and mulattoes, and then it expanded. It expands after targeting Black folks to include Mongolians or Indians, before outlawing all marriages of persons of Caucasian bloods or their descendants with Negroes, Mongolians, or Indians and their descendants. This was state law at the time of statehood. It prevented many multiracial people from having legal marriages, and it deepened distance between Black Arizonans and other communities. That's what the legal effect of these policies were. It also dispossessed mixed race children of inheritances they may have been able to claim. And this kept people of color from having families protected under state sanction. So in this sense, this is a policy that affected more than Black Arizonans. It affected people across the state, but it was put there to target that specific communities and others in a racialized fashion. In this sense, because of the fact that this policy was passed and affected so many other people, Black Arizonans are central, right? Central to the way we have to understand Arizona's history. Next slide. So there's other things such as formal legislation was compounded by private discrimination. So this is an example. This is a picture of the town McNairy. Black migration continued to Arizona during the early 20th century to places such as this. It's a lumber community in eastern Arizona that was funded by a lumber company from Louisiana, McNairy, Louisiana. And they moved basically their entire operation from Louisiana to Arizona, and they brought all their workers with them. Well, their workers were Black. And so in this sense, what you wind up seeing then is a continued migration of people, but it exists at the same time that exclusion is occurring. Exclusion is occurring because of the informal exclusions based on where one could live, where one could work, so on and so forth. These types of passive discriminations help justify exclusion based by other people of color. And so in this sense, anti-Blackness as an organizing principle of civic life, it enabled other forms of informal exclusion that sustained a racial hierarchy in the American West. Still, despite these challenges, Black migration to Arizona continues, right? If we go to the next slide, we can look at professionals such as the Texan migrants, Winston and Abra Hackett. They were two of the leading contributors to the community during this time. They moved to Phoenix during World War I, and shortly after they opened the Booker T. Washington Hospital in East Lake Park. Ava Hackett, she was famously the first Black woman to publish a newspaper in the state. Their engagement in civic life encouraged other Black professionals, including the first Black dentist in the state, to move here. And their efforts provided healthcare for people excluded from equal opportunity and access elsewhere. So in this sense, what we wind up seeing are people creating opportunities despite the issues that they're faced within the community. But once again, there's still the dark side to this specific experience. Ava Hackett, unfortunately, after all the things that she does, she passed away at a young age during the Great Depression, and her husband lost his sight less than a decade later, and he was forced to shutter Booker T. Washington Hospital, the sole institution in the state dedicated to Black healthcare. And so we come again to this duality of people's triumphs, but also the terrible sadness of the, despite the potential of the region, this historical narrative seems to bend towards despair. And so this leads to the conclusion of my talk. Next slide, please. That this darkness is not, and I would argue cannot be, the dominant feature in our narrative, because we're so much more than that. The culture of anti-Blackness that I'm describing is more that it just saturates the historical record. But at this moment in Arizona, there are almost as many African Americans as Native Americans, and we have the state with the largest indigenous population in the country. There's also more African Americans in Arizona, so more Black Arizonans in this state than any other Western state outside of California or Texas. So there's a way in which, as I've shown you, we're central to the dominant narrative, but we haven't been included. Our stories are rendered indiscernible within those tales. This is due to, I argue, a couple things. Next slide. Well, the first, and this is why we're all here today, is because of the exclusion of African-American sources from archival collections. Many of the narratives I told you today, they're recovered from Anglo sources, or told by Anglo voices, but I had to go to a specific text to find them. Black Arizonans got to be positioned to tell their own story and not have others tell our stories for us. That's the easiest way to counteract the things that pervade our historical narrative. And this is why something like the Black collections is so critical for the development of a more enlightened way of looking at our history. Because the contributions of African Americans, the contribution they made to the region, the story of it is not complete if we're left out of it. And the story of it is incomplete if we're not included as agents of change in history, because our history is Arizona's history. But additionally, and this is the next slide, it's important that we have a more expansive interpretation of who a Black Arizonan is. So this is why I want to leave you with a final story. When I was in California last, I saw that there was a Wilson C. Ryle School outside of Sacramento. And if any of you are familiar with Flagstaff, you'll know that there's a street named after him there as well. So I was curious to learn more about who this man is. You know, what I found is that he fits many of the tropes discussed in the work of Richard Harris. He migrated to Arizona from segregated Louisiana. He was drafted into the military. He was the first Black student to enroll and graduate from NAU, and after the war became the principal of Dunbar Elementary School in Flagstaff. During the early 50s, he helped desegregate the school district, and finding himself then out of a job, he moved to California to work as a consultant for the Department of Education. Now, in 1970, he ran to serve as the superintendent of education in the state of California, and he won, becoming the first African-American to win statewide office in California. So Wilson C. Riles, I argue, he took what he could from Arizona. He migrated here, he got military experience, he excelled in multicultural education. But moreover, he took this knowledge elsewhere. He made his experience work for him. The light in our collective history is not the struggle of survival, but I argue the joy of arrival, the joy of becoming and finding yourself where you want to be. And so when we consider the themes that typify the history of Black Arizona, perhaps if we consider those who left as much of our community as those who stayed, we can see this place through a different lens, not as a, however you want to call it, but not what the history or the narratives may say it has been, but as a healing space and hopefully a launching pad for pioneers of the future. Thank you all for giving me the time to share this work with you. I deeply appreciate the opportunity, and I'm indebted to the work, as I said, of Jessica and Nancy and the rest of the archivists for putting things together so that I can continue to spend my time digging through the crates of what we have in archives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We really appreciate you. And thank you so much for being able to come back and give your presentation, because your work is very, very important. So I'm gonna come up here to so y'all can see me. So we want to thank you all again for being with us in person and online. This event has been, and I say this with every event that we do here at ASU Library, but it truly has been a labor of love. And as Anthony primed me so graciously, Black Collections here at Arizona State University is so important in order for us to make sure that we are working to understand the Black and African American history of Arizona. And I couldn't do this work and I couldn't have the opportunity to talk about all of the great things that are going on within Black history if it wasn't for scholars like Anthony Pratcher, if it wasn't for people who have been a part of this entire symposium throughout the entire day. So I want to thank each and every one of the people who were involved this afternoon and this morning, throughout the day, honestly. And I want to thank all of you. Because again, without your support, this collection and the work that we're doing here at Arizona State University and the library specifically would not be possible. And I also want to thank some of the people in the audience, Jen Mary, Isabel Caderas, and Todd Bailey from Arizona Historical Society. I want to thank you all because without your tremendous partnership and support, I don't think we're going to be able to get where we're anywhere without us being in partnership and us being connected in the work that we're doing. So I want to thank you guys specifically because you are all out there doing that work as well. And I can't thank you enough for having me be a part of some really awesome things that are coming up. The Juneteenth event that's going on June 19th. So I also want to thank the people from SHPO who came and who are online. Thank you all so very much. We really, really appreciate you. We had more closing remarks, but obviously we're over time. So thank you. Oh yes, we have a day 2 on April 22nd at Public Library, which is this upcoming Saturday. We will be doing workshops. As Nancy said in the morning, I will be doing an Archives 101 workshop at 10 o'clock. And then we have been, Leilani was here, but she actually had to leave. She will also be doing a workshop at 1 o'clock. Yes, 1 o'clock at Burn Bar, Central Library, downtown Phoenix, regarding oral history and the work that she is doing as a Denine and a Black woman. And so we hope to see you there. We will not be doing a Zoom with that, so you will only be able to see these presentations or these workshops in person. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you all. We really appreciate you. Have a good rest of your afternoon and evening.